After our math discussion, now let's move to the graphs and talk about how we're going to derive this profit maximization on a graphical way. Okay, and here, if you remember, we are still in this section, the second section. We're still on the markets for factors of production. Okay, so in terms of the graphical analysis, we're still gonna do the classical supply and demand analysis. All right, now let's start with the demand. Okay, because as we said, the firms are gonna be on the demand side. Okay, and they want to hire workers, they want to rent equipment, tools, or land. Okay, all right, and here a very important concept which we already discussed in the previous video is a marginal product of labor. Okay, but here let's get it defined and look at its curve on the graph. Okay, the definition here is the extra amount of output the firm gets from one extra unit of labor, holding the amount of capital fixed. Okay, again, as we already said, when the firm adds one more unit of labor, how many units of output it will be able to produce. Okay, how many extra units of output. All right, and a very important economic principle we would introduce here is called diminishing marginal product of labor. Okay, this means the marginal product of labor decreases as the amount of labor increases, holding the amount of capital fixed. It is also called law of diminishing returns, LDR. Okay. Now, first of all, why when we add more and more labor into the production, the productivity of the last unit of labor added decreases, because the MPL is the measure of the productivity, right? And the key here is holding the amount of capital fixed. Okay, now a quick example would be if we put assembly line in a workplace, let's say in a classroom. Okay, and then when we hire the first, the second, or even the 10th workers working along the assembly line, they assemble the parts to make equipment. Okay, and so when we keep adding more and more labor into our or along the assembly line, as you could imagine, we're gonna have a problem, because till one moment we're gonna find that there's too many workers along the assembly line, right? They simply do not have enough room to move around, not to mention production, okay, or producing something. All right, in other words, it's just get too crowded. Okay, the assembly line is packed. And of course, when we add more and more labor in production, if we at the same time add more capital, like add more assembly lines, then we won't have this issue, right? So that's why the diminishing returns to labor is actually determined by the fixed amount of capital. Okay. Now here, if we want to put this on the graph, we could put labor on the horizontal axis and put output on the vertical axis. So the curve here we put is the total product or total output curve. Okay. As you can see, we pick three specific level of labor, and every time we move to the right by one unit, So that's what we mean by adding 1 unit of labor in production. Okay, so when we move this from this point to this point on the curve, that simply means, on the horizontal axis, the units of labor increases by 1. Okay, and then here the vertical axis tells us how many units of output we get from 1 extra unit of labor. Okay, this is exactly what we just defined, MPL, marginal product of labor. All right, and of course here you can see MPO equals this much, and the last one, the MPO is gets smaller, right? And graphically, you could always say that the slope of the production function or the total output curve equals MPL, because the slope between this point and this point would be just the vertical distance divided by the horizontal one, right? And the horizontal one is always equal to 1, right? Because we always add 1 more unit of labor in production. That's so-called marginal analysis, right? We make small, teeny tiny moves instead of the big one, right? And of course, the smallest one we could add, smallest unit of labor we could add to production is 1. Okay, and so here the vertical distance becomes MPL, okay, or becomes the slope, because the slope equals the vertical distance divided by the horizontal. Okay, the horizontal equals 1, of course, then the slope would just be the vertical distance. Okay, a very interesting observation we could make here is when we add more and more labor into our production, the total product curve gets flatter. Okay, like as you can see here. Okay, or another way to see this is graphically the MPL gets smaller and smaller, right? This is exactly what we just discussed. It's called law of diminishing returns. Okay, another way we could express the same idea on the graph is to draw the MPL curve. Okay, so we still put units of labor on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis, and units of output on the vertical axis. I'm sorry, and units of labor on the horizontal axis. Okay, and even for MPL, if you go back and look at the definition, it's extra amount of output the firm gets, okay, when adding 1 more unit of labor. So the MPL is expressed in the units of output. That's why this vertical axis is still output. However, what you can find is we get a downward sloping MPL. Okay, again, when we add more and more units of labor in our production, so we're moving towards the right, you would find that the MPL is declining. Okay, again, this is because the capital is fixed. Okay, so in front of each piece of machinery, equipment, tools, we have too many workers, okay, but too few machinery equipment. Okay, so the lastly added units of labor becomes less and less productive. Okay, so that's why it's downward sloping. Okay, and in the next video we're gonna discuss a very important application of LDR. Okay, and the application is Thomas Malthus' study about the relationship between population growth and food supply. Okay, and this is a pretty classical work, in economics and also in population studies. Okay, and it's not directly related to the neoclassical model, which is a central topic of this chapter. However, the LDR is just so important. Okay, remember in your introductory course, we learn law of supply, law of demand, right? We said whenever we use this L word, that means we believe it's universally true. Okay, so this is probably the third law you learn in economics. Okay, law of diminishing returns. And so we think it's worth looking at some real world application and help you have a develop a solid understanding of this law. Okay, all right. The next video, again, we're going to talk about the relationship between population growth and food supply.